Hi, everybody, and welcome to What's Happening in the U.S. Life Science Labor Market, presented by Don Alexander, who's the founder of GeneCoda, and hosted by the North Carolina Life Science Virtual Networking Group. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Emerson Hewitt, and I lead a small biotech-focused software company called Synthesis. I'm here today on behalf of the North Carolina Virtual Networking Group, however, which we founded in early March to safeguard the really vibrant and incredible life science community here in North Carolina and give that community a platform during the COVID-19 outbreak. For the duration of the transition to virtual events, we're going to be providing resources and connections and support to individuals and life science groups in the area who would like to put on a virtual event but don't have the know-how or the resources or the time to figure out how to do that. Tonight, we're proud to have provided the event organization and the video platform that we're using, and that's one of the services that our group provides for free to anybody that needs it. Join us in the Slack channel, which is the link at the bottom of the screen, or find me on LinkedIn if you're interested in putting together an event, and we'll help you get that off the ground. Tonight, doing the heavy lifting and actually presenting is Don Alexander, and I think Don really represents so much of what makes this community special. I'm really looking forward to seeing him again at an in-person event when we're able to go back into the real world and having a beer together. Before I hand things over to Don, I'll give you a quick rundown of Crowdcast, which is a platform we're using. You'll see the chat box over to the right. Feel free to enter questions there. There's also the Ask a Question button at the bottom, which will queue that question up for Don to answer at the end of his presentation. And you can also vote on other people's questions if you would like to see that question answered. And finally, if you hit any technical issues, we found that just refreshing your browser will fix them, and you'll pop right back into the presentation. The presentation is also being recorded, so you can rewatch it at the same link, and you can also share that link with anybody you think would benefit. So without further ado, here's Don Alexander of GeneCoda.
Thank you so much, Emerson. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you all this afternoon, and really just wanted to give another brief shout out to the North Carolina Life Sciences Virtual Networking Group that Emerson, Matt, and the good folks at Synthesis have put together for us. If you're a member of the life sciences community in North Carolina, I highly advocate going ahead and signing up. It's free and been a very good service, I know, for me personally. So for those I haven't met, my name is Don Alexander. I work with GeneCoda Professional and Executive Search, and we focus on life sciences recruitment throughout the United States, pharmaceutical biotechnology companies, medical device diagnostic companies, and the service sector and tools companies that support our scientific industry, our medical research industry. And we've been producing for a period of time a report, a labor market report called Life Sciences Pulse that we'll be going into in some detail tonight. But before we do that, my hope is that technologically I'm going to be good with figuring everything out. I have told the dog to not bark and my kids not to yell and scream for the next hour. So hopefully this will work out okay. I'm going to share a screen here. And hopefully you are able to now see what's called the jobs posting dashboard. So before we get into the life sciences sector specifically, I wanted to use this as an opportunity to also really thank, honestly, our data provider, which is IMSI. And this job postings dashboard is free for anyone to use, and I think Matt will be posting the link on how to access that. But I wanted to point out a few things about this before we got into the main part with the life sciences sector. You can really use this job postings dashboard in a variety of different ways and search different industries, occupations, job titles, skills, etc. And you'll see state-by-state breakdown. So here's North Carolina. And what we're looking at is, again, a percentage change month over month and year over year. Now, I'm going to tell you, looking at some of this data is not for the faint of heart. And in fact, tomorrow we will probably get a pretty challenging report from the Bureau of Labor Statistics tomorrow morning. But you can see the top industries just to give you an idea of the top occupations. But what I also wanted to point to, which MZ doesn't have on their dashboard, is a second screen, which is the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, the BLS. And this screen, and I'm sure Matt will put this up as well, this link rather, this is the industries in alphabetical order. So I find using the first tool, it's really easiest if I'm going to copy basically, and if I'm going to do industry, for instance, I'll paste this into the industry if I can do that. There we go. There's accommodation, and if I wanted to search that industry, I can look at that very easily. The search features here, the drop-down boxes, make it a little challenging if you don't already know what the industries are. So this is a link to all of them that are tracked by what's called the North American Industry Classification Code, NAICS for short. And this is really basically a grouping of various business orientations within the country. So that'll be helpful, I think, in terms of actually searching this data. And really what it's doing is giving you a current 12 months view versus the previous 12 months. And of course, as most people are probably aware, we are on a downward trajectory at this point. So that could be useful if you have, just like I do, and like many of us on this call, if you have relatives, friends, family, et cetera, that work in other industries, this is a way for free to kind of track what's going on. The last thing I wanted to point out before we get going into the presentation really is the sign-up form. I think Matt will probably provide that link if he hasn't already, but you're welcome to sign up for our Life Sciences Pulse report. The new edition is out as of today, and we're going to be covering some of that this afternoon. One caveat, please read, we do segment by email list what type of function basically that you hold within the industry, because we do send a little bit of follow-up information that we find would be helpful depending on what your function actually is. So it's best to just select one of these functions. Although the screen allows you to select many, just select one, otherwise you'll find yourself with multiple emails. So with that, let's go ahead and get into the heart of things. Bear with me just a moment. So just a word on the Life Sciences Pulse report. So, what is it that we're actually tracking here? What we're tracking is all ads that are posted online. So MZ, their data service has, let's just call them web bots who crawl the internet. And the technology is able to deduplicate advertisements or posts, and they're able to place them in these various NAICS codes that are specific to industry. What we then do is think about the definition, if you will, of the industry, and we use a bio-industry report. And we place this in the report so you can reference it, but we use a bio-industry report to identify which NAICS codes, in essence, are specific to the industry. And our focus on, this particular report is on the product makers and that are specific to the industry and the support services companies. But BIO's report itself goes a bit broader and really goes into the distribution channels as well. So I wanted to note that we put the specific NAICS codes that we cover in our report right there so that you can see them. So with that, let's move on into what we're what we actually saw in the first quarter of 2020. So this figure 1 is the comparison of all U.S. current life science job postings compared to the prior year. Now, this kind of graphic is what's most often viewed in the labor market, and that is the year-over-year comparison in terms of sum totals. So we find that in Q1 of 2020, employers posted 544,000, roughly, ads in the first quarter, and that was up from about 515,000 ads in the fourth quarter of 2019. So we can see kind of, again, that upward progression. And that represented roughly a 5.5% increase on a quarter-over-quarter basis, and then about a 13% year-over-year increase. So going from blue to red here, and so we were pleasantly surprised to see a fairly robust quarter in the first quarter of 2020, and so that was our initial findings there. Moving on to figure 2, this particular slide covers the comparison of quarterly sums, means, and standard deviations of sector ads. And as we kind of get into this, what I wanted to do is take the opportunity to speak. If you're unfamiliar with moving averages and statistics, a moving average is a calculation to analyze data points by creating a series of averages of different subsets of the full data set. And so given a series of numbers and a fixed subset size, the first element of the moving average is obtained by taking the average of the initial fixed subset of the number of series, and then the subset is modified by shifting forward, or that is excluding the first number of the series and including the next value of the subset. The idea behind the moving average, which is denoted by the 2-period moving average of the black line right here, is really to smooth out the short-term fluctuations and highlight trends or cycles that we may see. We actually use a similar model in our forecasting of the following quarter. And 2 points that I'd like to touch on with respect to this particular figure 2. And one of those is that in Q1 of 2020, what we saw is that there has been a moving average decline for 2 consecutive quarters in a row. And what that would suggest then to us is that ads would in fact follow that same pattern downward in Q2 of 2020. We also note that the standard deviation, generally, because this is measuring inter-quarter, the standard deviation of the months within that quarter, whenever things move on a rapid format, whether it's up or whether it's down, we tend to see more standard deviation, which suggests, again, some level of volatility one way or another. So then what we'll do is review some of the subsector components that make up the life sciences sector in the report. And so figure 3 is the 3-year quarterly industry posts by subcategory. And we'll go into a little more detail with each of these, but the RTM, Research Testing Medical Laboratories, is denoted by the red bar graph. PMM, Pharmaceutical Manufacturing, Medicine Manufacturing, is the blue graph, and then MD, or Medical Device and Equipment, is the green segment. Now, one thing that we like to try to touch on or review when we're looking at this particular graph is in this figure is the relationships between the different subsector components. So if you notice that here in Q2 of 2017, we see that the RTM and PMM components advertised roughly the same figures. And as we moved along throughout some time, a couple of quarters later, in particular Q4 of 2017, we see those patterns start to diverge, and we see them really diverge from that point heading forward into the present day. And so what that tells us, or what we believe that tells us, is that the trend might be best characterized as the overall industry trend towards outsourcing. And that's because the RTM segment of the market contains many of the names that you would think to outsource to if you're in the industry. So figure 4 is our first subsector. It's the 3-year research testing medical lab ads broken down by quarter. And again, at this point, we'll start to look at these different subsectors. We note that in this particular quarter, that RTM increased roughly 18% on a year-over-year basis. So did increase also clearly from Q9 to Q4 2019 to Q1 2020, but also increased on a fairly significantly on a year-over-year basis. Once we get into the pharmaceutical and medicine manufacturing ads by quarter subsector here, as denoted on figure 5, what we are doing here is we're introducing the concept of equity correlations. Now, the stock market is known as what's called a leading indicator. Employment has historically been thought of as a lagging indicator, but there's evidence to show that employment is in fact maybe a leading indicator, or perhaps what's known as a coincident indicator. Leading indicators provide more foresight as to where things may be heading, while lagging indicators, as their name implies, act as more of a confirmatory after the fact observations. So since ads themselves generally precede hires, or employment is one way to think about that, ads posted should give us a leading indicator or a leading signal, if you will. Now, what we do specifically is we normalize, what I call normalize equity and ad posts at the beginning of each quarterly report, because what we really want to do is look at where divergences between equity prices as denoted rather in the blue line, where those kind of trend versus the trends in the actual ads posted during that quarter. So we'll see in some cases pretty significant differentials in the relative correlations of prices to stock market prices to ads actually posted. And really what we're doing in this case is reviewing more of the trend lines, if you will. And so when we compare the ads posted, say over the past quarter versus relative equity prices, we do notice again that Q1 of 2020 would suggest to us that downward momentum, if you will, heading into the second quarter of this year, which we're already in. So we'll now look at the we'll look at the medical device and equipment ads by quarter, which is figure 6. And we note that on a year-over-year basis, the MDE segment of the market increased roughly 6%. So again, with MDE, we do notice that there is downward momentum heading into the second quarter of this year. But one thing, again, to touch on, and this doesn't always happen, all three of the subsector components showed positive year-over-year growth. So if we think about RTM, PMM, and MDE, that again that doesn't always happen in lockstep. So now what we'll do is get into kind of, I guess, what I'm going to call the high-level summary, if you will, on what we might expect going forward. And, I think this is certainly talked about on the news on how difficult forecasting is in a variety of circumstances given COVID-19. So we just make that blanket statement that it's kind of hard to forecast at this point, even more so than usually. But we do put a forecast of about 520,000 total postings for the sector heading into Q2, which if that number's accurate, that would represent about a 6% decrease from the second quarter of last year, so the same time frame. We do see that really more in a single digits capacity within the range because, as the statement here says, the U.S. government investment, of course, there's other governments as well, investing in various diagnostic tests, medical equipment, repurpose new drugs, vaccines. And so just given the inherent nature of the industry that we find ourselves in, we don't see as significant a downside as perhaps with other sectors of the economy that are in fact being hit, reasonably hard at this juncture. In addition, we also expect the average ad age duration, which is presently at about 48 days, to continue to increase in the first half of 2020 as roles take longer to fill. Now, the theme behind this is that this is partly due to the logistics associated with interviewing, but it also contemplates a more tepid response for those presently employed to actually change employers during the pandemic. So, our advice, even under, this set of circumstances, is for companies to plan. In essence, they should plan several weeks out, if not months, in advance to recruit highly specialized skill sets in the industry. So if you need to hire in September, my advice is to start getting going in June. And so it's important to kind of think about that as well. Now, just a comment on average ad duration. That's the period of time that an advertisement is posted on average for, our definitional set here. So that's, again, writing in around 48 days right now. So finally, as part of the formal presentation, I'm going to put up a screen that we don't ordinarily include in the report itself, but and if you'd like, feel free to take a screenshot of this particular slide if you're able to do that. This is for anyone that may be seeking, in particular, new employment. This is as many companies as I could reasonably fit on the slide here, a grouping of those companies and their number of ad posts. You'll recognize many, many names within the subset. And one thing I wanted to draw your attention to on this slide, this total versus unique posts. So using, I guess, Lattice Holdings as an example, they have the number to really focus on is the unique postings, 18,831 unique postings versus the 225,000. So think of the idea that a post may be carried across different platforms, Indeed, LinkedIn, a company's own website. So that same grouping of 18,000 posts is really what you want to keep your eye on. the unique posts of the industry rather than the total posts. And that's what, again, we look at in the report is the unique posts. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and open it up to some Q&A and hope to address questions that you all may have about the report. We can also touch on some other aspects that we're seeing, as an organization. So I'm happy to do that too, based on how many questions we have and the time that we have remaining. So I'm going to scoot out of that real quick and bear with me a moment. And let's see if we can go to the questions. So question number 1 is, does PMM include drug development or just manufacturing? So that includes drug development and manufacturing companies. So the historical names, and I should have mentioned this earlier, so I appreciate you raising the question. The historical name set that you would see in the PMM segment would be companies like Bristol Myers Squibb, like GlaxoSmithKline, like Abbott. So those would be the companies actually manufacturing, the innovators in a sense, but it also includes the generics companies as well. Where you're going to see an RTM, just to dovetail on that question for a moment, if you were to look at the MDE segment of the market, you might see names like Medtronic, for instance. And in the research, testing, and medical labs, the RTM segment of the market, you're likely to see names like IQVIA, like LabCorp, like Quest Diagnostics. So those are going to be some of the names that would be, I guess, inherent in each of those different subsectors. And I appreciate actually that question because I meant to mention that earlier. Let's see, the second question I see is, can you talk us through the last page to understand the layout and how to interpret the data again? So Diane, if I could ask the last page of, I'm going to put bear with me a second, I'm going to put the slide deck back up. And let's see, hold on one second. If you can let me know which, as you think you see the last page. Sorry, so this was the last page I think you're referring to. So the data interpretation on this last page. The main thing to really look at is, obviously the names that are contained here. These are the biggest posters by a good margin. But what I like to look at is the unique postings versus the total postings, because the total postings of, let's take Leidos, for example, would be 225,000, whereas there's only 18,800 some odd unique postings. And so what happens is you get cross postings, which are really the same job post, but they may be advertised across different sources, such as, again, LinkedIn, Indeed, or a couple of the major areas that companies go to post roles, in addition to their own website and other trade organizations. So hopefully that answers your question. If it doesn't, let me know, and I'll try to come back to that. Let's see, what is happening with clinical research organizations? So I'll go back to that. With clinical research organizations, and is the data embedded into one of the categories you mentioned? So if by definition, Diane, clinical research organizations, meaning CROs, the data would be captured as part of the RTM segment of the market. So the research, testing, and medical labs is where you're going to find names like IQVIA, PPD, Covance, LabCorp, names of that nature where their posts are going to fall. In terms of, so hopefully I've answered that question. Please let me know if I haven't, though, and I'll try to expand on it. Emerson, what do you think the rest of 2020 looks like for the labor market? That's a great question, and I appreciate that. I'm going to touch on a few themes that are specific to the life sciences segment of the labor market. I do think it's going to be challenging for the overall labor market, to some degree challenging for the life sciences sector through the remainder of the year, but my answer is going to be a little more directed towards the life sciences side of the equation. What we're seeing now is, and I talk to a lot of people and at very senior levels, and it's really their information that I'm providing at this point. What we see is, and really the question I like to ask is, as a result of COVID-19, was the hire itself put on hold, or was it eliminated? And what I've heard 95% of the time is that it's a postponement or a deferral rather than a position elimination. So then the next question becomes the when. And what there's been fairly good concurrence on, from what I've found, is that we're looking at a Q2 postponement to later Q3 and into Q4 of this year. Now, Q3 is historically slower in the industry from a hiring point of view anyway. So when you start to get into the summer months, people take vacations. They get, hopefully we'll get to the beach and things of that nature. So we do see things slow down a bit comparatively to the first, second, and fourth quarters of any given year. So COVID-19 or not, that is the trend, and I've been looking at this for years, and that's the trend that we really see from recessions through recoveries. It's the same pattern, but the slope of the pattern can look very different. So I'm fairly optimistic on hiring overall in the life sciences sector. Is again, the industry's finding solutions to COVID-19. We're part of the solution, if you will. And, I've even hypothesized that in some sense we could conceivably, and this is a very contrarian view, but we could conceivably see a bit of an upward spike in hiring with government funding and companies that are chasing basically various options or various solutions. I'm going to couple that answer also with a relatively low unemployment rate in the life sciences industry to begin with. So we start from very low points, and I would argue that in some skill sets you'd be looking really at a negative unemployment rate. And then the last factor that I'd just touch on with respect to that question is that I've not seen any evidence of mass layoffs in the industry. And I did look, there are people that have been furloughed, and we can touch on specific segments if you want to, but I did look earlier this week, searched Google real hard for, words like reduction in force, layoff. And again, it's because I hadn't learned about, any mass layoffs, anything that would be part of like the WARN Act here in North Carolina, 50 employees or more. And I found very, very little evidence to support any kind of mass layoff, at least at this point in time. So I think that through the rest of this year, again, I look at it more as a push in hiring in many cases, or a deferral, than whether the need has evaporated. So let me know if you have further questions about that. Do you perceive any interaction confounding between the categories of RTM, CROs, and TMM sponsored companies. That's okay. Don't worry about the acronym. I get it wrong half the time myself, since both are tightly bound to one another. In the report, that's a great question. And in the report, what we actually do is we've really started to look at the correlation between those two segments, because they are in many ways, many of the names are kind of intrinsically tied to each other. And the RTM segment of the market is really really surpassed the PMM segment as the largest overall poster of ads. And that really, again, that just happened around the 2017, maybe 2016 timeframe. So they're inextricably linked. And we do like to look at the correlations between those two. I think it can safely be said that if PMM as a subsector component goes down significantly or goes up, the RTM segment will, to a large degree, will follow that pattern. It would be hard to support, I think, RTM as at a robust level without a strong PMM segment. What skill sets within the life sciences currently typically will have the lowest unemployment rates, as you mentioned? That's another great question. Appreciate that being posed. So in the report itself, we list some of those. And these are hard skills that I'm going to mention here in the report, but also reflect on that. We see that again, these are kind of hard skills or keywords, if you will, but pharmaceuticals, GMP, auditing, new product development, clinical trials, SOPs, QC, and project management are some of the sought after skill sets when the technology kind of strips away the keywords, if you will, elements from different ad posts. It looks at, what keywords appear the most frequently in those relative posts. Now, I guess just anecdotally from my own point of view, I would concur with those. I think I would probably add skill sets in areas like regulatory affairs, certainly in biologic asset development. I suppose there'll be a renewed interest in infectious disease. We see, companies that are leveraging existing platforms to develop new assets that might be related to COVID-19 that maybe weren't in that market before. So data scientists is another one that strikes me. The need for bioinformaticians is very strong. And I think, again, that'll continue to be a very robust area. Those are probably some off the cuff answers, but those would be at least a few. So we don't have any immediate new questions from the audience, and I'm not one to kill or stand between the audience and perhaps a cold beverage on a Thursday evening. But we do have another question here. Thank you, Diane. So do you foresee life sciences labor market impacts due to government's hiring for improved public health services? So that's a great question. And this is kind of what I was touching on with the idea that with federally funded, I believe the figure was around $8.3 billion in the original package, but please correct me on that if I'm off base somewhat. But the idea that the federal government is putting significant funds into R&D and overall development capabilities really for COVID-19 may lead to some level of spike in certain cases in hiring. I would think that would be true. If memory serves, again, 8.3 billion is, well, maybe a little less than a third of the NIH's budget. Somebody please correct me on that, but I want to say it's somewhere in the neighborhood of a third of the entire annual budget. So when you think about just that raw dollar figure, how much that is, it leads me to believe that there could be some some level of spike activity. It'll be hard to derive probably from the absolute numbers what exactly that looks like, but that could lead to that. So if no new questions from the audience, I'll mention one last thing, and again, appreciate the North Carolina Life Sciences Virtual Networking Group for hosting us here this evening. One thing I wanted to just touch on with you or offer up, if I might, is that the nature of the market can really be segmented into different areas. So some areas could be, even within the life sciences sector, could be getting hit harder than others. And some examples that we've seen are, there are some companies that are in fact taking some pay cuts that we've learned about. There are in clinical trials, there are, suspensions of new trial starts and new enrollments of ongoing trials. We have also learned that, manufacturing and laboratories are in essence rotating staff. So that is, again, one impact of COVID-19. And we're seeing sales representatives that are also in the medical device and pharmaceutical sales industry in a broad sense stymied because they don't have access right now. It's necessarily to the hospital or to the surgeon, the physician. So they're all trying to figure out ways to navigate, I guess, if you will, in the new normal, if that's what you want to call it. So I think that just as kind of a parting note, as you think about these things going forward, there are different aspects depending on the specific area that's being discussed. So with that, I don't see any new questions. I want to thank everybody for their time this afternoon. Again, thank you to the North Carolina Life Sciences Virtual Networking Group for hosting. Be safe, enjoy the warming temperatures outside, and I'm very glad that my dog didn't bark. Thanks, everyone.